Listen closely. In the red clay lands of Mississippi, where the cotton grows tall and the sun beats down like a overseer's whip, there was a woman the people called Sarah of the Pit. It wasn't a name she chose. It was a name carved into her by suffering, like hot iron pressed to flesh. For 60 days she stayed at the bottom of a dark hole, speaking with rattlesnakes, singing to the ancestors who crossed the middle passage in chains. When she rose from that hell of dirt and poison, she rose carrying in her bony hands the strength to break the spine of a cruel man. This story isn't in the white man's books. No. It lives in the mouths of the people, in the memory the red earth drank and never forgot. So come closer to this low fire, because this remembrance still burns. The night came down heavy on the quarters, thick like molasses dripping slow from a broken jar. Sarah was just a slip of a girl then, barely 12 summers old, but her eyes already carried something the overseer couldn't whip out, a hunger that wasn't for food. In them days of deep sorrow, when the cotton fields stretched endless under the burning Mississippi sun, and the master's big house gleamed white like a lie told in daylight, most children her age had already learned to make themselves small, to move through the world like shadows that don't cast no reflection. But Sarah, Lord have mercy, she was different from the start. She sat in the darkest corner of the quarters that night, the cabin walls pressing close around her kin, Mama Ruth sleeping fitful after 16 hours in the fields, little brother Thomas curled like a question mark on the dirt floor, and old Aunt Dinah humming low, that ancient hum that carried memories from across the water, from the land where drums still spoke and spirits walked free among the living. The child had stolen something that day. Not food, though her belly ached hollow, not cloth, though her dress hung in rags. She'd stolen a piece of charcoal from the cookhouse fire pit, black as midnight, small enough to hide in her palm when the driver passed by with his whip coiled like a sleeping snake on his belt. Now, in the quiet dark, with only the sound of her mama's troubled breathing and Aunt Dinah's hum threading through the air like spider silk, Sarah took that charcoal and pressed it to the rough wooden floor. Her hand trembled, not from fear alone, but from something deeper, something fierce. The ancestors watched, sure as I'm telling you now. They always watch when a soul reaches for freedom, even if that freedom is just the freedom to mark your own name on wood that don't belong to you. Say R-A-H. She'd seen the letters on the master's papers when she brought water to the big house, seen them in the Bible the mistress read on Sundays before church, her lips moving like she was tasting honey while black folks stood in the back sweating through their one good shirt. Sarah had stolen them letters with her eyes, one by one, hoarding them in her mind like gold pieces. The charcoal scratched soft against the floor. Her name appeared, crooked and uncertain, but real. Real as the chains, real as the whipping post standing in the yard like a crucified tree. Real as the auction block down in Vicksburg where they'd sold her daddy when she was 8 years old for less than a good horse cost. "Child, what you doin'?" Sarah's hand froze. Her heart beat like African drums, loud, insistent, dangerous. She looked up and met Aunt Dinah's eyes, those ancient eyes that had seen things no person should witness and survived anyway, because surviving was the only revenge the powerless could claim. The old woman's face was a map of sorrow, deep lines carved by sun and suffering, skin dark as rich delta soil, hair white as cotton bloom under a full moon. She'd been brought over on the ships when she was just a girl herself, stolen from a village whose name she wouldn't speak aloud for fear the sound would kill her with remembering. "Aunt Dinah, Hush now." The old woman moved closer, her joints cracking like dry kindling. She looked down at the name scratched on the floor, and something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been pride or might have been terror. Folks swear on their lives that what happened next changed everything. Aunt Dinah knelt slow, her bones protesting, and placed one gnarled finger on the word Sarah had written. "You know what you done, child? You claimed yourself. In them days when master thinks he owns even the breath in your chest, you went and wrote your own name. That's dangerous magic, girl. Dangerous as conjure, dangerous as running north." Sarah's throat went tight. "I just wanted to see it, Aunt Dinah. Wanted to know I was real. Oh, you real baby, real as suffering, real as the ancestors calling from across the water. The old woman reached for the charcoal, and for a terrible moment Sarah thought she'd throw it in the fire, destroy the evidence. Instead, Aunt Dinah held it like it was sacred, like it was a mojo bag or a piece of John the Conqueror root. Then she wrote, slow and deliberate, another word beside Sarah's name. Freedom. The letters stood there on the floor between them, black on brown, impossible and inevitable as dawn after the longest night. Freedom. The word the master forbid, the word that got folks sold down the river or hanged from oak trees with moss swaying like mourners. The word that sang in spirituals disguised as hymns about crossing over Jordan, about chariots swinging low, about stealing away to Jesus when what they really meant was stealing away to the North Star. Now you listen here, child, Aunt Dinah whispered, her voice carrying the weight of all the souls lost in the middle passage, all the babies sold away from crying mamas, all the men broken at the whipping post. This here is the first word you need to know. The only word that matters when everything else is stripped away. You hold this word in your heart like it's your true name. You keep it secret and safe, you hear? Secret as the hush harbors in the woods, safe as the root doctor's prayers. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. The cabin felt full of spirits suddenly, the dead ones who'd crossed the ocean in chains, the ones who'd been worked to death in these very fields, the children sold south and never seen again. They all pressed close, bearing witness. Can you teach me more words, Aunt Dinah? The old woman's face became a battlefield between hope and fear. She looked toward the cabin door, toward the darkness outside where paddy rollers rode at night with dogs and guns, hunting runaways, where the overseer slept in his house near the big road, dreaming whatever dreams cruel men dream. I can teach you, child, but you gotta understand, each word you learn is a weapon and a burden both. Master finds out, he'll sell you or worse. Knowledge is rebellion in these quarters. You ready for that? Sarah thought of her daddy being led away in chains, thought of her mama's scarred back, thought of little Thomas and what life waited for him when he got old enough to work the fields full time. She thought of all the things nobody ever wrote down, the true count of how many died in the fields, the real names of babies born in the quarters, the crimes committed by white men who faced no earthly justice. I'm ready, Aunt Dinah. Then we start tomorrow night. But now, the old woman reached down and rubbed the words away with her calloused palm, erasing the evidence like it had never been. But Sarah could still see the letters burned into her mind, permanent as brands, bright as stars. Go on and sleep now, girl. Tomorrow the sun rises early and the fields don't wait for nobody's dreams. Sarah lay down on her pallet of rags and Spanish moss, but sleep wouldn't come easy. She stared up at the cabin roof where moonlight leaked through gaps in the boards, making patterns like secret writing. Her mind raced with possibilities, all the words waiting to be learned, all the stories waiting to be told, all the truths waiting to be recorded. Outside, an owl called from the cypress trees down by the creek. Some folks said owls were bad omens, messengers of death or spirits of the restless dead. But Aunt Dinah always said owls were wisdom birds, creatures that could see in darkness when other things went blind. Sarah listened to that owl singing its lonely song and made a promise to herself, to the girl she was and the woman she'd become. She'd learn every word she could steal, collect them like weapons, use them to bear witness. Master might own her body, might claim her labor, but her mind would stay free as the North Star shining cold and constant over the slave quarters. That's when it happened. Hoofbeats outside, sudden and close. Sarah's blood turned cold. Through the gaps in the cabin wall she saw him, Silas Crow, the overseer, sitting tall on his horse, moving slow through the quarters like a hunting cat. The horse's hooves made soft sounds in the red clay, deliberate measuring. He stopped right outside their cabin. Sarah couldn't breathe. Beside her, Aunt Dinah had gone perfectly still, and even in the darkness the child could feel the old woman's fear radiating like heat from a branding iron. Silas Crow sat there for what felt like eternity, his shape dark against the slightly lighter darkness of the night. Then he spoke, voice carrying easy through the thin walls. "I know you're awake in there." Nobody answered. The silence in the quarters spoke loud. That terrible silence when everybody holds their breath and prays to become invisible. Something's stirring in these quarters. I can smell it like smoke before fire, like rebellion before the whip. You all think I don't know, but I know everything, everything. His horse shifted, leather creaking. Then Silas turned his head, and through the gap in the board, Sarah saw his eyes, pale and cold, reflecting moonlight like coins at the bottom of a well. He was looking directly at their cabin, directly at where she lay. "Sleep tight now," he called out, voice dripping with something worse than anger, something like anticipation. "The Lord sees all, and so do I." Then he rode on, slow, taking his time, making sure every soul in the quarters knew he'd been there, knew he was watching, knew that nothing, not even the secret learning of forbidden words in the dead of night, could stay hidden forever. Sarah lay there in the dark, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might wake the whole plantation. Aunt Dinah's hand found hers in the darkness and squeezed once. A warning, a promise, a prayer all in one touch. And in that moment, the child understood. She'd started something tonight that couldn't be stopped. The first word had been written. The first name had been claimed. Now there was only one way forward, deeper into the knowledge that could save her or kill her, one stolen word at a time. 5 years passed like water through cupped hands, fast and relentless, leaving only damp traces of what had been. Sarah wasn't a child no more. She was 17 now, body lean and strong from the fields, mind sharp as any blade the master owned. All them nights in the cabin with Aunt Dinah, learning letters by firelight so dim it barely pushed back the darkness, had made her something dangerous. A woman who could read and write in a world that forbid such things. The old ones warned us, knowledge is power, and power in the wrong hands makes white folks nervous as cats in a room full of rocking chairs. In the quiet of the quarters at night, while others slept the deep sleep of the bone-tired, Sarah kept her secret records. She had papers now, stolen sheets, torn corners, backs of discarded plantation documents salvaged from the trash pile behind the big house. She had ink too, made from pokeweed berries and soot, kept hidden in a small bottle buried beneath a loose board under her pallet. She wrote everything. Names of babies born in the quarters, their mama's names, the date they drew first breath, names of the dead, and there were so many dead, with the causes written plain. Worked to death, fever, whipped, sold and died of grief. She kept count of cotton bales that left the plantation versus what the master claimed in his books, kept record of food rations short-measured, of promised Sunday rest days stolen back, of every injustice too small for white folks to notice, but big enough to break spirits. But most dangerous of all, she wrote about what Silas Crow did. The overseer had gotten worse over the years, if such a thing was possible. His cruelty had ripened like fruit left too long on the vine, turned rotten and sweet-sick both. He moved through the quarters like a haunt, taking liberties no decent man would take, hurting folks in ways that left deeper scars than any whip. Sarah documented it all. Every girl he cornered in the smokehouse, every woman called to his cabin after dark, every scream cut short by a hand over the mouth and a threat whispered low, "Tell anyone and I'll sell your children." She wrote their names like a litany, like a prayer, like an accusation waiting for Judgment Day. That morning started like every other, the conch shell blowing before dawn, calling them all to the fields like the master was God himself summoning his flock. But something felt different in the air, heavy and electric like right before a storm breaks. Sarah was hoeing cotton when she saw Silas Crow riding up from the big house with a girl walking behind his horse. The girl's name was Esther, just 16, pretty as spring morning with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that still held some hope despite everything. Had held hope, Sarah corrected herself, seeing how the girl walked. Something in Esther had shattered overnight. She moved like a woman underwater, like the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders, crushing her into the red Mississippi clay. Sarah knew that walk. She She'd seen it before, too many times. The walk of a woman who'd been taken, broken, robbed of something that couldn't be given back. By midday, word spread through the fields like wildfire in dry grass. Esther was being sold. Master had a trader coming tomorrow. The girl would be gone south, down to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where folks worked till they dropped and died young from fever and exhaustion. Why? Somebody asked, but they all knew why. Selling was easier than facing questions. Selling was how you disposed of evidence. Selling was what you did when a girl knew too much about what happened in the overseer's cabin on dark nights. That night, while the quarters settled into exhausted sleep, Sarah sat with her stolen papers and her pokeweed ink and made a choice that would change everything. She wrote it all down. Every detail. Esther's name. The date. What Silas Crow had done. She wrote it like testimony. Like she was standing in a courtroom where justice actually existed for folks with dark skin. She wrote it knowing that such a courtroom was a fantasy, but writing it anyway because the truth had to be recorded somewhere, had to live on something besides the wind and whispered rumors. When she finished, she stared at the papers in the dim firelight. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the recognition of what she held. These pages were dynamite. Proof. Witness. Accusation. They were also a death sentence if found. But Sarah remembered something Aunt Dinah had told her before the old woman died last winter. Her body finally giving out after years of carrying too much suffering. Baby, sometimes bearing witness is the only power we got. Even if nobody listens now, someday somebody will. Somebody has to keep the true count. Sarah folded the papers small and tucked them in her dress. Then she made another decision. This one even more dangerous than the first. There was a white man in the town of Meridian, about 15 miles west. Folks whispered about him in the hush harbors. Said he was a preacher, an abolitionist. One of them rare white men who thought slavery was sin, and said so out loud despite the danger. They said he helped runaways sometimes, passed messages, documented atrocities to send north to the newspapers that would print such things. His name was Reverend Thomas Blackwood. Sarah had never met him, never even seen him. But she'd heard enough to know he existed, and that was sufficient. She would get her testimony to him somehow. Let him carry the weight of this truth. Let him be the one to speak it in places where her voice would never be heard. The plan formed in her mind like storm clouds gathering. Next Sunday, when they all went to the white folks' church to sit in the back and listen to sermons about obedience and accepting earthly suffering, she would find a way. She would slip the papers to someone, or hide them where the reverend might find them, or, "What you got there, Sarah?" Her blood turned to ice water. She looked up and saw him standing in the doorway of the cabin, Silas Crow, his pale eyes gleaming in the firelight like a predator's. How long had he been watching? How much had he seen? "Nothing, sir. Just mending." "Don't lie to me, girl. I seen you writing. Seen that guilty look on your face like you've been caught with your hand in the master's cash box." He stepped into the cabin, and the space shrank around him. Other folks in the quarters started waking, but nobody moved. Nobody ever moved when Silas Crow was hunting. "You know what happens to slaves who learn to read and write?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, which made it worse. "You know what the law says about such things?" Sarah's mind raced. The papers were still folded in her dress. If he searched her, found them, read what she'd written. "I don't know nothing about writing, sir. Can't read, can't write. Just like I'm supposed to be." He laughed then, a sound like breaking glass. "You're a liar, Sarah, but that's all right. I like liars. Gives me something to work with." He moved closer and she could smell him. Whiskey and tobacco and something rotten underneath. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to show me what you wrote. You're going to tell me who taught you. And then we're going to have a long conversation about what happens to uppity slaves who forget their place." Sarah's hand moved to her dress, feeling the papers hidden there. In that moment, she made a calculation. If she gave them up, Esther's story would be buried forever. The truth would die. The witnesses would be silenced. But if she refused, "I ain't got nothing to show you," she said quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. and I ain't telling you nothing." The blow came fast, his fist catching her on the side of the head, sending her sprawling. Stars burst behind her eyes, and she tasted copper blood in her mouth. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard him shouting, heard other folks crying out, heard the whole quarters coming awake to the sounds of violence they knew too well. Then he was on her, searching, his hands rough and invasive. He found the papers, pulled them from her dress, unfolded them with shaking fingers. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Silas Crow read slowly, his face going from red to white to purple. Sarah watched him from the floor, blood running down her chin, and saw the exact moment he understood what she'd done. Saw him realize that his crimes had been recorded, documented, preserved in ink and paper. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "You wrote about me. You wrote about Esther. You wrote—" He stopped, crumpling the papers in his fist. "You condemned yourself, girl, and you condemned every soul in these quarters." He turned to the others who'd gathered in the doorway, watching with wide, terrified eyes. "Let this be a lesson. This is what happens when you reach above your station, when you forget what you are and where you belong." He dragged Sarah out of the cabin by her hair, pulled her across the quarters toward the whipping post that stood in the center of the compound like a cursed tree. Behind them, folks followed at a distance, unable to look away, unable to help. At the post, Silas tied her hands above her head with rope that bit into her wrists. The rough wood pressed against her face, and she could smell old blood in the grain. The blood of everyone who'd been punished here before her, going back decades, going back to when this plantation was first carved out of Creek and Choctaw land. "Count them," Silas ordered someone. Sarah didn't see who. The whip sang through the air. She'd heard that sound her whole life, but experiencing it was different. The first lash felt like lightning made solid, like her back had split open and fire had poured in. She bit down on a scream, determined not to give him the satisfaction. The second lash came, the third. By the 10th, she lost count. By the 20th, she lost the ability to stay silent. Her screams joined the chorus of all the other screams this place had swallowed over the years, becoming part of the land itself, soaking into the red clay like rain. When it finally stopped, she hung from the post like a broken doll, consciousness flickering like a candle in the wind. Through the pain, she heard Silas reading her words aloud, mocking them, destroying them sentence by sentence in front of everyone. "This is what comes of learning," he proclaimed, his voice carrying across the quarters. "This is what comes of pride. This is what comes of thinking you're something more than property." He burned the papers then, one by one, holding them over a torch until they caught fire and turned to ash. Sarah watched through swimming vision as Esther's testimony went up in flames, as 5 years of careful record-keeping disappeared into smoke. But even as her body broke and her work burned, Sarah felt something hardening in her chest. Not defeat, not submission. Rage. Pure, clean, and sharp as a blade. Rage that would wait. Rage that would grow. Rage that would, in time, demand payment in full. They cut her down eventually and dragged her back to the cabin. Folks tended her wounds as best they could with what little they had. Cool water, strips of cloth, whispered prayers. Sarah lay face down on her pallet, her back a landscape of torn flesh, and whispered to herself words that nobody else could hear. "If the words burn me, then I'll burn back. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. I swear it on my ancestors, on the spirits of the Middle Passage, on every soul that ever died in chains. Someday, I'll burn everything down." Outside, dawn was breaking over the cotton fields, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the morning conch shell calling them all back to work. Because suffering didn't pause for healing. Because bondage showed no mercy for weakness. Because this was the world they lived in, and it would take more than words to change it. But Sarah was learning. Oh yes, she was learning all sorts of things. Sarah's back healed slow, the way deep wounds always do, leaving scars thick as rope and memories deeper still. 3 weeks passed before she could stand straight, 6 before she could work the fields without wanting to scream. But the body mends faster than the spirit, and her spirit was carrying a weight heavier than any cotton sack. Esther was gone. Sold south just like they said she would be. Gone to the sugar fields where life expectancy was measured in seasons, not years. Gone like she'd never existed, except in Sarah's memory and in the ashes of burned testimony scattered on Mississippi wind. The guilt ate at Sarah worse than any whip. She'd written Esther's story thinking it would help, thinking documentation was power. Instead, she'd sealed the girl's fate, made her a liability, turned witness into evidence that needed disposing. In them days when sorrow sits heavy on your chest like a gravestone, you learn that good intentions and actual good are two different things entirely. But Sarah kept writing, couldn't stop, even knowing the danger. She was more careful now, hid her papers better, wrote in smaller script, used codes when she could. She recorded births and deaths, short rations and long hours, the slow grinding away of souls under the machinery of bondage. It was compulsion by then, sacred duty, the only way she knew to bear witness in a world designed to erase her people's existence. And she'd started on something new, something that scared her, even as she wrote it. A letter, not to the master, not to the law. Both of those were jokes cruel as any Silas Crow told. No, this letter was addressed to Reverend Thomas Blackwood, the abolitionist preacher in Meridian, the one who supposedly helped freedom seekers, the one who documented atrocities and sent them north to newspapers that would print such things. Sarah wrote it over 2 weeks, working by firelight so dim it barely pushed back the darkness, her scarred back aching with every movement. She wrote about the plantation, not just her plantation but the whole system. Wrote about children sold away from crying mamas, about punishments that would make the devil himself look away, about the daily grinding cruelty that was considered normal, legal, righteous even. She wrote about Silas Crow. Every crime, every victim, every dark night when screams got swallowed by fear and silence. She wrote it all down with a clarity that comes from rage refined by time. And she wrote it anonymous. No name, no signature. Just testimony from a witness who'd seen too much to stay silent forever. The question was how to get it out of the plantation, how to move a piece of paper across 15 miles of hostile territory, patrolled by paddy rollers and white folks who'd shoot a slave on sight if they were off the property without a pass. The answer came from an unexpected place. There was a free Negro who came to the plantation once a month, Benjamin, a blacksmith from town who the master hired to shoe horses and repair tools. He was old, maybe 60, with hands scarred from decades of working hot metal and eyes that had seen the world from both sides of freedom's fence. Sarah had watched him for months trying to read him. Free Negroes were tricky. Some were allies, some were more dangerous than white folks because they had something to lose. Some would turn in runaways for the reward money. Some would sell out their own people to protect the small freedoms they'd managed to claim. But Benjamin had kind eyes. And once, when the overseer wasn't looking, she'd seen him slip extra cornbread to the children in the quarters. Small thing, maybe, but small things were how you measured character in a world where kindness was contraband. So Sarah made her gamble. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late August, when Benjamin came to work the forge near the barn. Sarah volunteered to carry water, anything to get close to him without raising suspicion. She waited until Silas rode out to check the far fields, waited until the master was napping in the big house, waited until the moment felt as right as it ever would. "Mr. Benjamin," she said quiet, setting the water bucket down beside the forge. "I got something needs carrying to town." He didn't look up from the horseshoe he was hammering, but his hands paused for just a heartbeat. That's so. Letter for Reverend Blackwood. Important letter. Now he did look at her, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "Girl, you know what you asking. You know what happens to me if I get caught carrying anti-slavery correspondence. I lose my freedom. Probably lose my life." "I know," Sarah whispered, "but I also know you got 3 grandchildren living in bondage on the Preston plantation. I know you've been trying to buy them free for 5 years. I know. How you know that? I listen. I watch. I remember. She pulled the letter from where she'd hidden it in her bodice, folded small and tight. This letter tells truth that needs telling. Truth about what happens here. About what Silas Crow does. About... Her voice cracked. About a girl named Esther who got sold south after she was violated. About all of us carrying weights nobody should have to carry. Benjamin stared at the letter like it was a snake that might bite. Why Reverend Blackwood? Because they say he's righteous, they say he helps. They say he got connections up north, people who'll listen to testimony like this and maybe, just maybe, do something about it. Girl, you putting a lot of faith in maybes. Maybe is all we got. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the hiss of hot metal meeting water. Finally, Benjamin reached out and took the letter, palming it smooth as a card-sharp handling-marked deck. It disappeared into his coat so fast Sarah barely saw the movement. I'll get it to him, Benjamin said, voice low. But you listen to me good, child. If this blows back, I don't know you. If they come asking, you never spoke to me about nothing but water and horses, you understand? Yes, sir. And Sarah, he looked at her directly now. You got courage in you. Maybe too much courage for a world that punishes it. You be careful. She nodded and picked up the water bucket, walking away before anyone noticed them talking too long. Her heart was hammering like drums in a ring shout, and her hands shook with a mixture of fear and hope. The letter was out. The testimony was moving. For the first time since Esther's sale, Sarah felt like maybe, that dangerous maybe, something good could come from her writing. She should have known better. 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon when the sun hung low and red like a wound in the sky, Silas Crow came riding back from town. And he wasn't alone. With him rode the master, and behind them came a wagon carrying Sheriff Morrison and 2 deputies. They all rode straight to the quarters and dismounted like the 4 horsemen of a personal apocalypse. Silas was holding something in his hand. Even from a distance, Sarah could see what it was. Her letter. The master's voice carried across the quarters, cold and sharp as a blade. Bring me the girl called Sarah. Bring her now. And Sarah knew, with the absolute certainty that comes from living under tyranny, that her gamble had failed. Benjamin had been caught, or turned her in, or the letter had been intercepted. The how didn't matter. Only the what came next mattered. And what came next was going to be worse than anything she'd imagined. They dragged her to the big house like a condemned woman walking to the gallows, and maybe that's exactly what she was. The whole quarters followed at a distance, unable to look away from the terrible theater that bondage made of suffering. Children clutched their mama's skirts. Old folks murmured prayers under their breath. Everyone knew something bad was coming. You could smell it in the air like smoke before fire, like blood before the killing blow. On the wide porch of the big house, with its white columns gleaming in the late afternoon sun like the pillared gates of hell, they made Sarah stand in front of them all. The master sat in his rocking chair, a glass of whiskey in one hand and her letter in the other. Silas Crow stood beside him, his face twisted with a satisfaction that made Sarah's stomach turn. Sheriff Morrison leaned against a column, chewing tobacco and watching like this was entertainment. Read it, the master commanded Silas. Read it out loud so everyone can hear what this uppity negra wrote about us. Silas unfolded the letter with theatrical slowness. His voice when he spoke was mocking, cruel, turning her careful testimony into a joke, transforming her pain into punchline. To Reverend Blackwood, he began, and already people were gasping, understanding the magnitude of what Sarah had attempted. I write to you as a witness to crimes that cry out for judgment. He read it all. Every word about the children sold, the women violated, the men broken. He read her descriptions of Silas himself, his nightly visits to the quarters, his threats, his violence. He read the count she'd kept of short rations and stolen wages. He read Esther's name and what had happened to her. And he laughed. God forgive him, he laughed at every sentence like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. The master didn't laugh. His face had gone hard as stone, red creeping up his neck like a rash. When Silas finished, the silence was heavier than chains. "Is this true?" the master asked quietly. Not asking if Sarah had written it. That was obvious. Asking if the accusations were true. Silas's laughter died. "Sir, you know how these people are. They make up stories, blow things out of proportion. I've been firm, yes, but fair. Everything I've done has been within my rights as I asked if it's true." The overseer's jaw clenched. Sarah could see him calculating, deciding how much to admit, how much to deny. Finally, "Some of it may have basis in fact, but the interpretation is all wrong. These Nigras don't understand discipline, don't understand..." "Enough." The master stood, and for one insane moment, Sarah thought he might actually care about justice. Thought he might actually do something about Silas's crimes. She should have known better. The master walked to the edge of the porch and looked out over the quarters, over his property, human and otherwise, spread before him like a kingdom. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who'd made a decision and found peace in it. "I don't give a damn what Silas does in the quarters, as long as the work gets done and the cotton gets picked. What I give a damn about is a slave who can read and write well enough to compose a letter to an abolitionist preacher. What I give a damn about is uppity behavior that threatens the natural order of things." He turned to look at Sarah directly, and she saw then that he wasn't angry. He was afraid of what she represented, the idea that his property could think, could write, could bear witness. "You've been writing things down," he said. It wasn't a question. "Keeping records. Playing at being something you're not, something you can never be." Sarah wanted to speak, wanted to defend herself, but her throat had closed up tight. The master continued. "Silas tells me you survived the whipping post without breaking. That's admirable in its way. Shows strength, but strength in a slave is like a wild horse. Needs to be broken proper or else it's dangerous to everyone." He nodded to Silas. "Show her." The overseer's grin was wolfish. He gestured to two of his drivers, and they led Sarah down from the porch, away from the big house toward the edge of the cotton fields, where the land got rough and wild. The whole population of the quarters followed like a funeral procession. They walked maybe a quarter-mile to a place Sarah had heard about but never seen. A clearing in the red clay where weeds grew sparse and the earth looked disturbed, like something had been digging there recently. In the center of the clearing was a hole. Not a grave exactly, though it was grave-sized. Deeper than a man was tall, narrow as a coffin, with wooden boards laying beside it ready to cover the top. "We call this the pit," Silas announced, his voice carrying across the assembled slaves. "Used to use it for storing root vegetables in winter, but we found a better use for it." He walked to the edge and looked down. Sarah followed his gaze and felt her blood turn cold. The bottom of the pit was moving, writhing, a mass of snakes, rattlers mostly, their scales catching the dying sunlight, their rattles making a sound like dry bones shaking in a gourd. Dozens of them, maybe more, coiled and tangled together in the dark. "Copperheads and rattlesnakes," Silas said conversationally. "Been collecting them for a month now. Caught them in the woods, in the barn under the porches. Kept them hungry, kept them mean." Sarah's legs went weak. She tried to back away, but the drivers grabbed her arms, held her fast. The master spoke from behind her. 60 days, that's the sentence for what you've done. 60 days in the pit with the serpents. If God sees fit to preserve you, you'll come out. If not," he shrugged, "then that's divine judgment on your crimes." "No," Sarah whispered. Then louder, "No. You can't." "I can do whatever I want with my property," the master said coldly. "Consider yourself lucky I'm not just hanging you from an oak tree and being done with it." Silas grabbed her by the hair. "Any last words before you meet your new friends?" Sarah looked around at the faces of her people. Terror and pity mixed together, helplessness worn like a second skin. She thought of Aunt Dinah, dead now, but watching from whatever place the ancestors watched from. Thought of her mama, her daddy sold south, little Thomas with his wide, scared eyes. She thought of Esther, disappeared into the sugarcane hell of Louisiana. And she thought of every word she'd ever written, every name she'd recorded, every truth she'd tried to preserve. "I ain't sorry," she said clearly, "for none of it. You can throw me in that pit, but you can't throw away the truth. Somebody gonna remember. Somebody gonna—" They threw her in before she could finish. The fall knocked the wind out of her, and she hit the dirt bottom hard, pain shooting through her ankle. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then she felt them. The snakes sliding over her legs, her arms, her back. Felt their dry scales and their coiled strength and heard their rattles like Satan's own orchestra. She screamed then. Couldn't help it. Screamed until her throat was raw and her voice broke into sobs. Above her, the wooden boards slid across the opening, cutting off the light. Not complete darkness. Cracks between the boards let in thin streams of sunlight, enough to see the writhing mass around her, enough to make out the triangular heads and cold reptile eyes. She heard Silas's voice, muffled but audible. 60 days, Sarah. 60 days to think about what happens when you forget your place, if you last that long." Then footsteps walking away, voices fading, the sounds of the quarters returning to their rhythm of work and survival. And Sarah was alone in the dark with the snakes, and her fear and the knowledge that nobody was coming to save her. The first snake struck at her hand and she jerked back, pressing against the dirt wall. Her heart hammered like African drums, like the drums her ancestors played before white men stole them away. Her breath came fast and shallow, panic threatening to swallow her whole. But then something happened, something that would define everything that came after. In the darkness, pressed against the cool earth that smelled of death and old roots, Sarah heard a voice. Not with her ears, deeper than that. Heard it in her blood, in her bones, in the part of her that had crossed the ocean in chains and survived. The voice was Aunt Dinah's, or maybe it was older than that. Maybe it was all the grandmothers going back across the water, all the way to the shores of Africa, where the slave ships had first stolen her people. "Breathe, child. Breathe and be still. The serpent knows fear. The serpent smells panic. Be still and speak to them. They are elder creatures. They remember the old ways. Speak to them like kin." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing, tried to find calm in the center of terror. Around her, the snakes continued their endless movement, but none struck again. Not yet. She had 60 days to survive. 60 days to prove that even thrown in a pit, even surrounded by death, even buried alive, she was still Sarah. And Sarah didn't break. 7 days in the pit felt like 7 lifetimes. Time moved different down there in the dark, stretched out long and thin like taffy, or compressed tight like cotton bales under the press. Sarah couldn't tell anymore which way was which. The first day had been pure terror. The second, exhaustion mixed with fear so thick she could taste it, metallic and bitter on her tongue. By the third day, her body had started giving up. Muscles cramping from being unable to fully stretch. Throat raw from screaming herself hoarse that first night. Ankle swollen where she'd twisted it in the fall. But by the 7th day, something had shifted. The snakes were still there, Lord have mercy, still sliding over her in the darkness like living ropes, still rattling their warnings when she moved too sudden. But they hadn't struck again. Not once since that first day when the copperhead had gone for her hand, and she'd pulled back just in time. Sarah had started talking to them. It began out of desperation, out of loneliness, so deep it felt like drowning. Down in that hole with nothing but darkness and reptile company. A person's mind does strange things. She'd started humming first. Old spirituals Aunt Dinah had taught her. Songs that carried coded messages about freedom and crossing over Jordan. Songs her mama had sung in the cotton fields when the sun was high and the overseer wasn't listening close. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. The snakes seemed to calm when she sang. Their constant movement slowed, their rattles quieted to a soft susurration like wind through dry grass. So she sang more, sang until her voice gave out, then hummed, then just breathed the melodies through her nose. And she talked to them. Talked like they were kin, like they were fellow prisoners, like they understood something about being trapped in a place you didn't choose. "You and me both in this pit," she whispered in the dark. Both of us caught by men who think they gods. Both of us just trying to survive till tomorrow comes. The old ones warned us. In the deep places of the earth, the ancient creatures remember what humans have forgotten. They remember the time before slavery, before plantations, before white men decided they could own souls. They remember when the land was free and the spirits walked openly among the living. On the seventh night, Sarah had a vision. Or maybe it was a dream. Or maybe it was something else entirely. The kind of thing that happens when a body is weak and a spirit is strong, and the veil between worlds gets thin as spider silk. She saw them, the ancestors. Not just Aunt Dinah, though she was there, standing tall and proud like she'd never been bent by bondage, but others too, stretching back in a line that disappeared into darkness deeper than the pit. Men and women with markings on their faces she didn't recognize, wearing cloth she'd never seen, speaking languages that had been stolen from her people's tongues, but that somehow she understood anyway. They stood at the edge of the pit looking down at her, and their eyes glowed like coals in the dark. One of them spoke, an old woman with white hair braided in patterns that looked like rivers, like roads, like maps to places that existed before the maps were drawn by European hands. "Child of the water crossing, why do you weep?" "Because I'm dying down here," Sarah said. Or thought she said. "Because I'm alone and I'm scared and these snakes gonna kill me eventually." You are not alone. You have never been alone. We crossed the ocean with you. We survived the auction block with you. We have been in every field, every cabin, every moment of your suffering. Then why didn't you save me? Why didn't you stop them from throwing me down here? The old woman smiled, sad and ancient. We cannot change what has been set in motion by cruelty, but we can give you strength to survive it. You think the serpents are your enemy. They are your teachers. They are elder creatures who know the secrets of the earth. Speak to them with respect. Learn from them. Another ancestor stepped forward, a man with scars covering his chest in deliberate patterns, marks of some ritual or ceremony from before the stealing. He pointed at the snakes coiled around Sarah's legs. In the old land, before the ships came, the serpent was sacred, guardian of wisdom, keeper of secrets, symbol of transformation. Your oppressors fear the snake, but your ancestors honored it. Remember this. Sarah woke, or came back to herself, gasping. The vision faded but didn't disappear entirely, hovering at the edge of her awareness like smoke. She looked at the snakes with new eyes. In the dim light filtering through the boards above, she could see them more clearly. The copperhead coiled near her right foot, its pattern like autumn leaves. The rattlesnakes with their geometric designs, nature's own writing on living flesh. Elders, she whispered, using the word deliberately, speaking to them with the same respect she'd give to the old folks in the quarters. I hear you. I see you. I ain't your enemy and you ain't mine. We both just trying to live through this. A rattlesnake near her hand lifted its head, tongue flickering out to taste the air. Sarah forced herself to stay still, to breathe slow and steady. The snake watched her for a long moment, then lowered its head and settled back into its coil. Sarah began to hum again, and this time she felt it. A connection forming, thin and fragile as morning spider silk, but real. The snakes responded to her voice, to the vibration of the old songs in the close air of the pit. She sang about Moses leading people out of bondage, sang about Daniel in the lion's den, sang about trials and tribulations and deliverance that might never come but that you believed in anyway, because belief was all you had. And the snakes listened. Hours passed. The thin sunlight faded to darkness, and Sarah could no longer see the creatures around her. But she could feel them, their weight, their warmth in the cool earth, their breathing that was different from mammal breathing, slower and more deliberate. One of the rattlesnakes moved toward her, and instead of panic, Sarah felt something else. Curiosity, maybe. Trust, even. The snake slid across her lap, heavy and muscled, and began to coil around her waist. Sarah's breath caught, but she didn't move, didn't scream, just hummed low and steady, that same spiritual about wading in the water. The snake settled against her, and Sarah realized something profound. It was sharing its warmth. Down in the pit where the night air turned cold, where her body shook from chill and hunger and fear, the snake was keeping her warm. "Thank you, Elder," she whispered. More snakes followed. They draped across her shoulders, wound around her arms, pressed against her sides. Not attacking, not threatening, just there, sharing the space, sharing the survival. By dawn of the 8th day, Sarah sat in the pit covered in snakes like a living blanket, and she was no longer afraid. She was hungry, yes, thirsty, desperately, in pain from her twisted ankle and cramped muscles, but not afraid. Because she'd learned something crucial, fear was what they wanted from her. Fear was the point of the pit. But if she could let go of the fear, if she could make peace with death itself, then they'd already lost. A sound from above made her look up. Through the cracks in the boards, she saw movement, heard voices. Silas Crow's face appeared in one of the gaps, peering down like he was checking livestock. "Well, well," he said, surprise clear in his voice. "You're still alive. Figured the snakes would have done you in by now." Sarah looked up at him from her nest of serpents and smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who'd stared at death for 7 days and found she wasn't nearly as afraid of it as she'd thought. "Snakes ain't the dangerous ones in this world, Mr. Crow. You are." His face darkened. "We'll see how smart you talk in another 53 days, girl." He disappeared, and Sarah was alone again with the elders of the earth, the ancient ones who remembered what freedom tasted like before men put chains on it. She began to sing again, and the snakes moved with her voice like they were dancing to music only they could hear. 3 weeks in the pit, and Sarah's body was eating itself. She could feel it, the way her ribs stood out sharp under her skin, the way her arms had gone thin as kindling, the way her mind drifted in and out of the present like smoke on wind. They'd given her water twice, once on day 10, once on day 17, just enough to keep her from dying of thirst but not enough to call it mercy. A tin cup lowered down on a rope, and Sarah drinking it so fast she choked, coughing and sputtering while Silas laughed from above. No food at all. 21 days without eating, and hunger had become something beyond pain. It was a living thing inside her, gnawing at her belly, making her weak and dizzy and strange. The visions came more frequently now. Sometimes she couldn't tell what was real and what was her mind playing tricks. Sometimes she saw her mama standing at the edge of the pit, calling her name. Sometimes she was 8 years old again, watching her daddy being led away in chains, his face turned back toward her one last time before the slave trader's wagon disappeared down the road. In them days when your body fails, your mind goes walking in places it ain't supposed to go. Past and present blend together like watercolors bleeding into each other on wet paper. Sarah found herself remembering things she'd buried deep. Her mama's face the day they'd been sold to this plantation, the Mississippi master having bought them at auction in Natchez. Sarah had been just 5 years old, small enough to be carried. But she remembered. Lord, she remembered. Her mama had tried to smile for her, tried to be strong, but Sarah saw the tears, saw the way her mama's hands shook when the master examined them like livestock, checking teeth and joints and muscles, saw the moment when her mama's spirit broke just a little bit more. Another crack in a vessel already full of cracks. 3 years later, they sold her daddy. Said he was rebellious. Said he'd been caught teaching other slaves their letters. Same crime Sarah had committed. Same dangerous knowledge that made white folks nervous. Sarah had watched from the quarters as they loaded him onto a wagon headed for the deep South cotton plantations, where men worked until they dropped, and life expectancy was shorter than a dog's. Her mama had stood silent, tears running down her face, unable even to cry out loud because showing too much grief over a sale was itself a punishable offense. That night, Mama had held Sarah close and whispered, "Baby, you got your daddy's spirit. That reading bug done bit you too. But you gotta be careful, you hear? White folks catch you with knowledge, they gonna break you like they broke him." But Sarah hadn't been careful enough, and now here she was, in a pit full of snakes, paying for the same crime her daddy had paid for with separation and suffering. "I should have listened, Mama," Sarah whispered to the darkness. "Should have kept my head down, kept quiet, kept small." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. She couldn't have stopped learning any more than she could have stopped breathing. The hunger for knowledge was stronger than the hunger in her belly. Had been since the first night Aunt Dinah showed her how letters could become words. Words could become sentences. Sentences could become weapons. A rattlesnake moved across her lap, and Sarah placed her hand on it gently. The snake paused, then continued its slow journey across her body. Over the days, they'd developed an understanding, her and these elders of the earth. They knew her smell now, knew her movements, knew she meant them no harm. "Y'all are better company than most folks I've known," she told them. Her voice came out weak and raspy, but the snakes didn't mind. They just kept their ancient rhythm, their patience sliding through the dark. Sarah's mind drifted again, and she found herself thinking about all the things she'd written over the years. All those names, all those stories, all that testimony turned to ash when Silas burned her papers. But the memories were still there, burned into her brain deeper than any brand on skin. She started reciting them aloud. Names of babies born in the quarters, their birth dates, their parents' names. Names of the dead and how they died. Counts and figures and dates and details. She spoke them like a litany, like a prayer, like a promise. Marcus, born January 12, 1852, to Nell and Samuel, died of fever, age 3. Patience, sold south September 1853, pregnant, separated from her children. Job, whipped to death October 1854, accused of stealing bread he never took. On and on. Every name she could remember, every story she'd recorded, every truth she'd tried to preserve. She spoke them into the darkness of the pit, and the snakes listened with their ancient patience, and the earth itself seemed to hold witness. "If I die down here," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength despite her body's weakness, "somebody gonna remember, gonna tell the story, gonna make sure these names don't get lost." She made a decision then, born of hunger and determination and the kind of clarity that comes when you got nothing left to lose. If she survived this pit, and that was a mighty big if, she would write it all down again. Every name, every crime, every truth. But this time, she wouldn't stop at one letter to one preacher. She would write a whole book, a chronicle of plantation life told from the inside, from the quarters, from the perspective of the folks who actually lived it. She'd document everything. The daily violence, the small resistances, the spiritual practices that kept people sane. The love that persisted despite everything. The ways people found to be human in a system designed to make them livestock. And she wouldn't write it in secret. She'd write it bold and open. Consequences be damned. Because what worse could they do to her than what they'd already done? The thought gave her strength she didn't know she had left. She sat up straighter, despite the snakes draped across her shoulders, despite the cramping in her legs, despite the gnawing emptiness in her gut. "You hear that, Silas Crow?" She called up toward the boards covering the pit. "You hear that, Master? Y'all think this pit gonna break me, but it's doing the opposite. It's making me sure, making me certain that bearing witness is worth dying for." No response came from above. Maybe nobody was there to hear. Maybe they'd all gone back to the business of running a plantation, forgotten about the girl rotting in the punishment pit. That night, or maybe it was day, time had no meaning down there. Sarah heard sounds from above, footsteps approaching, the boards being lifted slightly, creating a gap big enough to drop something through. Food scraps fell into the pit. Just a handful, moldy bread, some kind of rotten vegetable, meat scraps that smelled off. The kind of garbage you'd throw to pigs. Sarah's stomach clenched with hunger so intense it hurt. She reached for the food with shaking hands, brought it to her mouth, and stopped. She looked at the scraps in her palm, really looked at them, saw them for what they were, a test. They wanted to see her degraded, wanted to watch her eat garbage like an animal, wanted to confirm their belief that slaves were less than human. Sarah's jaw clenched. Slowly, deliberately, she set the food aside. "I ain't that hungry," she said quietly. It was a lie, she was starving. But some things mattered more than survival. Dignity mattered. Self-respect mattered. Proving that you could choose even when all choices were terrible. That mattered most of all. The snakes moved around her in the darkness, and Sarah began to hum again. Her stomach growled and cramped, her body screamed for food, but her spirit felt stronger than it had in days. She would survive this pit, not because she was particularly strong or particularly brave, but because surviving was itself an act of resistance. Because every day she lived was a day she could remember, could bear witness, could hold on to truth in a world built on lies. The ancestors were watching, the snakes were listening, and Sarah de Cova was learning lessons no schoolroom could teach. Lessons about endurance, about dignity, about the difference between being broken and being bent. She wasn't broken yet, not yet. 40 days in the pit and Sarah had become something else. Not quite human anymore, not quite spirit. Something in between, a creature of earth and darkness and serpent wisdom, sustained by will alone when her body should have given up weeks ago. The quarters hadn't forgotten her. Lord have mercy, they hadn't forgotten. It started small. On day 23, Sarah heard singing from above, faint at first, like wind carrying voices from far away, but then clearer. Spirituals, work songs, the old hymns that carried double meanings, coded messages about freedom and resistance wrapped in words about Jesus and crossing over Jordan. The women were gathering near the pit at night, after the work was done, and the overseers had retired to their cabins. They couldn't free Sarah. That would mean death for everyone involved. But they could sing to her, could let her know she wasn't forgotten, wasn't alone. Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. Sarah's throat closed up with emotion the first time she heard them. She pressed her face against the dirt wall and wept, her body shaking with sobs that were equal parts grief and gratitude. The snakes moved around her in agitation, responding to her distress, but they didn't strike. They'd learned her moods by now, understood when she was suffering. "Thank you," she whispered up toward the boards. "Thank you for remembering me." The singing continued every night after that. Sometimes it was just 2 or 3 voices. Sometimes it sounded like half the quarters was out there, voices raised in harmony that spoke of pain and hope tangled together like roots under the earth. And they brought her things. Can't say how they managed it without getting caught, but they did. Small packages wrapped in cloth, lowered down on string through the cracks in the boards when the patty rollers weren't watching. Bits of cornbread no bigger than Sarah's thumb. Pieces of dried meat. Once a whole apple that Sarah ate core and all, tears streaming down her face at the sweetness. It wasn't much. Wasn't nearly enough to fill the hollow ache in her belly. But it was love made tangible. Solidarity transformed into substance. It was the quarters saying, "We see you. We honor you. We will not let you die alone in the dark." On the 40th night, something changed. Sarah woke from fitful sleep to hear whispering above. Not singing this time, but urgent low voices having a conversation. "Can't keep doing this. Silas gonna catch on. Hush now, we almost there. Just need to. What if he finds out? What if he throws all of us in pits? Then we go together. But we ain't leaving Sarah to die like some animal. She wrote our names down, remembered our stories. We gonna remember hers." Sarah's heart swelled. She recognized the voices now. Celia, who worked in the big house kitchen. Moses, the old driver who moved slow but had eyes that saw everything. Ruth, who'd lost 3 children to the auction block but still found strength to mother everyone else's babies. Her people, her kin. Not by blood, but by something deeper. Shared suffering, shared resistance, shared humanity in a world that tried to strip it away. "Sarah?" Ruth's voice came through the boards, barely above a whisper. "Baby, you still alive down there?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah croaked. Her voice sounded strange even to her own ears, rough and hollow, like something speaking from the bottom of a well. "Oh, thank Jesus. We've been so worried." We've been praying and singing and—" "Hush up, Ruth," Moses interrupted. "We ain't got much time. Sarah, listen good. Your story is spreading, not just in these quarters. Word is traveling plantation to plantation, carried by folks who visit, by slaves hired out to town, by runaways passing through on their way north." "What?" Sarah couldn't process what she was hearing. "What you mean, my story?" "They calling you Sarah de Cova," Celia said. "Sarah of the pit, saying you survived 40 days with serpents like Daniel in the Bible, saying you're touched by something powerful, saying you can't be broken." Sarah laughed, a harsh sound that startled the snakes. "Touched by something powerful? I'm half dead down here, eating scraps and talking to reptiles like they're my family." "Maybe that is the power," Moses said quietly. "Surviving what should kill you, keeping your mind when everything conspires to drive you mad, bearing witness even when they try to silence you. That's conjure, girl. That's root magic stronger than anything any hoodoo woman could work with herbs and bones." Sarah sat with that for a moment. Around her, the snakes moved in their endless patient rhythm. Above her, through the cracks, she could see a slice of night sky. Stars scattered like salt spilled on dark cloth. "Master gonna be mad when he finds out folks are talking about me," she finally said. "Let him be mad," Ruth declared with a fierceness Sarah had never heard from the gentle woman before. "Let him know that you can't just disappear people, can't just throw them in a hole and pretend they never existed. We remember, Sarah. We all remember. And we gonna make sure your story survives," Celia added. "Already told my sister on the Crawford plantation. She gonna tell folks at the hiring out in Meridian. They gonna tell folks at the docks in Vicksburg. Your testimony about Silas Crow, about what happens in these quarters, it might not have made it to that preacher, but it's spreading anyway. Mouth to mouth. The way our people always kept truth alive." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. For 40 days she'd been focused on survival, on making it through each moment without losing her mind or her life. But hearing this, hearing that her story had power even in defeat, that her attempted testimony was becoming legend anyway, it gave her something she'd thought was lost. Hope. Not the naive kind that believed everything would be all right. The harder kind. The kind that understood suffering was real and justice was rare, but that believed in fighting anyway, believed in bearing witness anyway, believed that truth had power, even when power tried to bury it. "You all shouldn't risk yourselves for me," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Too late for that," Moses chuckled. "We already in it. Whole quarters is. You became something bigger than just one woman in a pit. You became a symbol. Can't put that back once it's out." "Silas knows," Celia said grimly. "He's been watching the quarters like a hawk, trying to figure out who's singing, who's bringing you food. Yesterday he threatened to extend your sentence if the rebellious behavior don't stop." "Then stop," Sarah said urgently. "Stop coming here. Stop risking yourselves. I can make it the last 20 days on my own." "No," Ruth said firmly. "You can't. Not without help. And more than that, we can't. Can't just stand by and let you suffer alone. Wouldn't be human if we did." The words hung in the night air, and Sarah understood then what was really happening. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone in the quarters reclaiming some small measure of agency, some tiny act of defiance against a system designed to make them powerless. By caring for her, they were caring for themselves. By refusing to let her be forgotten, they were refusing to be invisible. By singing to her in the dark, they were declaring that their voices mattered, their stories mattered, their humanity mattered. 20 more days, Sarah said. Then I'm coming out of this pit, and when I do— When you do, things gonna change, Moses interrupted. Don't know how, don't know what form it's gonna take, but something's been set in motion that can't be stopped now. They left shortly after, melting back into the quarters before the patty rollers made their rounds. But their words stayed with Sarah, wrapping around her like a blanket warmer than the snakes, more sustaining than the meager food they'd managed to smuggle. She wasn't alone, had never been alone. And her story, Sarah de Cova, the woman who survived the serpent pit, was already being written in the collective memory of her people. 20 days left. Sarah closed her eyes and began to plan what came after. One day left. Just one more day and the sentence would be complete. 60 days in the pit with the serpents. And Sarah had survived against every odd, against nature itself, against the will of men who'd wanted her broken or dead. But she wasn't celebrating yet. Couldn't afford to. Because in that pit, surrounded by death that hadn't claimed her, Sarah had learned a crucial truth. Surviving wasn't the same as winning, and Silas Crow didn't like to lose. Her body was a ruin. 59 days without proper food or sunlight had turned her skeletal. Her skin stretched tight over bones that stood out sharp as blades. Her ankle, twisted that first day, had never healed right. Her hair, once kept neat despite bondage, was matted with dirt and filth. She looked like something that had crawled up from a grave, which in a way she had. But her mind was sharp, sharper than it had ever been. Hunger and isolation had burned away everything except the essential core of who she was, leaving her distilled, concentrated, pure as moonshine. And in the darkness of her 59th night, with the snakes coiled around her like living armor, Sarah decided to write one last time. She had no paper, no ink, no pen or pencil, or even charcoal. But the pit walls were dirt, and her fingernails, though cracked and broken, were sharp enough. So she began to scratch into the earth itself, carving words into the wall like ancient peoples carved their histories into stone. The ancestors watched. She could feel them gathering in the darkness, drawn by what she was doing. This wasn't just writing. It was ritual. It was testimony. It was the kind of magic that didn't need roots or herbs, just truth and determination and blood. She started with names. All the names she'd written before. All the names Silas had burned. She carved them into the dirt wall one by one, her broken nails leaving trails of her own blood mixed with earth. Marcus, son of Nell and Samuel, died age 3. Patience, sold south pregnant. Job, murdered for bread he never stole. Esther, violated and disappeared. On and on. Every name she could remember. Every story the plantation wanted erased. Her fingers bled, and the blood became ink, became part of the writing, became testimony that couldn't be separated from the body that bore witness. When she finished the names of the dead and the sold and the disappeared, she started on the crimes. Documented in crude letters scratched into dirt, but documented nonetheless. Silas Crow, overseer, took liberties with Mary, with Dinah, with Esther, with countless others. Used his position to... She couldn't write the details. Some things were too terrible to put into words even when words were all you had. But she wrote enough. Wrote dates and names and locations. Wrote a record that, even if no one ever saw it, existed. Existed in the earth itself, in the pit that was meant to bury her truth, but had instead become its keeper. Then she wrote about the system, about the auction block and the whipping post and the breeding practices and the family separations and all the countless daily violences that made up plantation life. She wrote until her fingers were raw meat, until she couldn't tell anymore where her blood ended and the dirt began. And finally, when the wall was covered with words barely legible in the dark, she wrote her own name. Sarah. Not Sarah, property of Master Thornton. Not Sarah, slave. Just Sarah. Her name, her identity. Herself, claimed in scratched dirt and blood. And beside it, she added the name they'd given her. The name that had spread from plantation to plantation, carried by whispers and songs and the underground network of communication that bondage couldn't quite suppress. Sarah de Cova. Sarah of the pit. She sat back against the opposite wall, her hands throbbing with pain, and looked at what she'd created. In the dim light filtering through the cracks above, the words seemed to glow faintly, like they were lit from within. Maybe it was just her exhausted mind playing tricks. Maybe it was something else. The snakes moved around her, agitated by the smell of blood. But they didn't strike. They never struck anymore. She was part of their world now, had earned her place through survival and respect. One more day, Sarah whispered to the darkness. One more day and I walk out of here. And then, Silas Crow, then we gonna see what happens next. She dozed fitfully after that, slipping in and out of dreams that were half memory, half vision. Saw Aunt Dinah teaching her letters by firelight. Saw her daddy being led away in chains. Saw Esther's face the morning she was sold. Saw all the faces of everyone she'd loved and lost. Everyone who'd been erased by the machinery of bondage. And she saw herself walking out of the pit, skeletal and scarred, covered in snakes like a biblical plague made flesh. And she saw Silas Crow's face when she emerged. And she woke to the sound of the boards being moved. But it wasn't dawn yet. The sky through the cracks was still dark, stars still visible. And the person moving the boards wasn't being careful. They were moving them quickly, urgently, like they didn't care who heard. Torchlight spilled into the pit, blinding after so long in darkness. Sarah threw her arm up to shield her eyes, and the snakes hissed and rattled, disturbed by the sudden light and noise. When her vision adjusted, she saw him. Silas Crow, standing at the edge of the pit, torch in one hand, coiled whip in the other. His face was twisted with rage and something else. Fear, maybe, or madness. Hard to tell the difference sometimes in cruel men. "One day early," he said, his voice shaking. "Can't wait one more day. Can't let you walk out of there tomorrow like some kind of prophet, some kind of symbol for all these rebellious nigras to rally around." Sarah understood then. He'd heard about her legend spreading, heard the singing, figured out about the food, realized that throwing her in the pit had backfired spectacularly. Instead of breaking her, it had made her powerful, made her a story that people told to give themselves hope. And Silas couldn't allow that. Couldn't allow her to survive and walk free, proving that his worst punishment hadn't been enough to destroy her. "You're supposed to die down there," he continued, his voice rising. "Supposed to be snake-bit and starved and driven mad. But you just kept surviving, kept being difficult, kept being uppity even from the bottom of a hole." He raised the whip. "So I'm ending this now. Going to come down there and finish what the serpents wouldn't. And then I'll tell the master you died on day 59. So close, but not quite made it. A tragedy. A warning to others." Sarah looked up at him from the pit floor, surrounded by her serpent companions, her hands bloody from writing, her body broken but her spirit intact, and she smiled. "Come on down then, Mr. Crow. Let's see what happens when you enter this pit." The snakes around her began to move, responding to her voice, to the vibrations in the air. Their rattles filled the pit with sound like bones shaking, like warning drums, like the voice of the earth itself saying, "No more." Silas hesitated at the edge, torch wavering. "Come on," Sarah repeated, her voice gaining strength. "You wanted me in the pit with the serpents. Well, I made peace with them. Now let's see if they make peace with you." For a long moment, Silas stood frozen, torch held high, staring down at the skeletal woman surrounded by snakes, at the walls covered in bloody testimony, at the thing he'd created through his own cruelty, a woman transformed into something he could no longer control. Then he made his decision. He grabbed the rope they used to lower water, wrapped it around his waist, and began to descend into the pit. Sarah waited, the snakes coiling tighter around her, preparing for what came next. One day left of the sentence. But Judgment Day had come early. Silas Crow descended into the pit like a man entering hell itself, which maybe he was. The rope creaked under his weight, his boots scraping against the dirt walls, sending small avalanches of earth raining down. His torch threw wild shadows that danced across the carved testimony on the walls, making the bloody words seem to move, seem to breathe. The snakes knew before Sarah did that something was wrong. They began to move with purpose, uncoiling from around her body, sliding across the pit floor with their ancient patient hunger. Rattles shook a warning that filled the narrow space like thunder confined. "Call them off," Silas demanded, his voice tight with fear disguised as anger. "Call off these serpents, girl, or I swear to—" "Or you swear to what?" Sarah's voice came out steady, cold, carrying an authority she hadn't known she possessed. "You already threw me in a pit to die. You already took everything you could take. What's left to threaten me with?" Silas's feet touched the bottom of the pit. He stood maybe 6 feet from Sarah, torch held high, whip coiled in his other hand. In the close confines of the hole, he seemed larger than life, his shadow swallowing everything. But Sarah had been living with serpents for 59 days. She'd learned not to fear things that hissed and threatened. The truly dangerous creatures were the ones who smiled while they hurt you. "I'll make it quick," he said, and there was almost something like mercy in his voice. Almost. "Won't drag it out, just can't let you walk out of here tomorrow. Can't let you become some kind of martyr, some kind of symbol for rebellion." Too late for that, Mr. Crow. Already happened. A copperhead slithered between them, its pattern beautiful and deadly in the torchlight. Silas stepped back, nearly dropping the torch. More snakes converged, drawn by the heat, the movement, the presence of an intruder in the space they'd shared with Sarah for 2 months. "They ain't gonna hurt me," Sarah said quietly. "We got an understanding, me and these elders. But you're new. Your threat, your prey." It happened fast. A rattlesnake struck at Silas's boot, fangs catching on leather. He jerked back, lost his balance, and the torch fell from his hand. It landed in the dirt and sputtered, the flame guttering low, but not quite dying out. In the dim, flickering light, chaos erupted. Silas swung his whip wildly, catching a snake and sending it flying against the wall. The other serpents responded with fury, striking from all sides. Silas screamed, a high, terrible sound that carried up through the open pit and across the quarters. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, watching with the detached calm of someone who'd already made peace with death. The snakes weren't acting on her command. She didn't have that kind of power. They were simply defending their territory, responding to threat the way wild things do when cornered. Silas fell to his knees, clutching at his leg where a rattler had struck true. His face was white with shock and pain. He looked at Sarah, and in that moment she saw him clearly. Not as the overseer, not as the embodiment of cruelty, but as a man. Just a man. Mortal and afraid and suddenly very small. "Help me," he whispered. Sarah could have called out for help, could have tried to pull him to the rope, could have shown him the mercy he'd never shown anyone else. The old Sarah, the one who'd gone into this pit, might have done exactly that. But 59 days had changed her. 59 days of darkness and serpents and blood scratched into walls. 59 days of surviving what should have killed her. 59 days of becoming something new. "No," she said simply. Silas's eyes widened with understanding. This was justice, not the kind dispensed by judges in courtrooms, but the older kind. The kind that required no lawyers or laws, just balance. What you gave to the world coming back to collect. The venom worked fast. By the time the commotion drew others to the pit, Silas was convulsing, foam at his mouth, his body shutting down system by system. By the time the master himself arrived with lanterns and ropes and shouting, Silas Crow was dead on the floor of the punishment pit, surrounded by the serpents he'd collected to torture a woman who wouldn't break. They pulled his body up first, afraid to leave it down there with the snakes. Then they lowered ropes for Sarah, shouting for her to grab hold, to come up, to escape before the snakes claimed her too. But Sarah took her time. She stood slowly, her body protesting every movement after so long in cramped quarters. The snakes parted for her like Moses' Red Sea, creating a path to the rope. She placed one hand on the largest rattlesnake, the one that had been her companion through the darkest nights, and whispered, "Thank you, Elder. Thank you for the lessons." Then she grabbed the rope and began to climb. 60 days the sentence was supposed to be. She was coming out on day 59, one day early because Silas couldn't wait, couldn't stand the thought of her emerging victorious on the 60th day. His impatience had killed him. His fear had been his undoing. Sarah emerged from the pit into the pre-dawn darkness to find the entire quarters gathered, their faces illuminated by torchlight, their eyes wide with something between horror and awe. She stood there on the edge of the hole, skeletal and filthy, covered in dirt and blood and snake scales, looking like something from the old stories, looking like a haint risen from the grave. The master stood there too, his face pale, his hands shaking as he held a lantern. He looked at her like she was a ghost, like she was something his rational white man's mind couldn't quite process. "Sarah," he said, and his voice cracked. You survived." She didn't answer right away, just stood there, swaying slightly, her body remembering how to stand upright, her eyes adjusting to the light after so long in darkness. The crowd waited in absolute silence, even the children quiet, everyone bearing witness to this moment when the woman who'd been buried alive walked back into the world of the living. Finally, Sarah spoke. Her voice was rough as gravel, but it carried clear and strong. "You buried me, threw me down there with death itself, thinking I'd disappear, thinking I'd break, thinking you could erase me like you erased all the others." She took a step forward, and the crowd parted for her, creating a path through the quarters. Even the master stepped back, something in her eyes making him retreat despite himself. "But I didn't die. I didn't break. And I'm walking out of that pit with more strength than I went in with. Because you can't bury truth. You can't kill testimony. You can try, but it just grows stronger in the dark." She looked at Silas's body being laid out on the ground, the snake still visible through the pit opening behind her. "You wanted to make an example of me, and you did. Just not the example you intended." Then Sarah turned and walked toward the quarters, and nobody tried to stop her. Not the master, not the drivers, not anyone. They all just watched as Sarah de Cova, the woman who'd survived 60 days in the serpent pit, close enough that one day didn't matter, walked like a prophet from the wilderness, walked like judgment itself, walked like the answer to a prayer nobody had dared to speak aloud. Dawn broke over the Mississippi plantation like Judgment Day itself, painting the sky red as blood, red as the clay soil, red as all the suffering that had soaked into this land over generations. Sarah stood in the center of the quarters, surrounded by her people, and felt the weight of 60 days, near enough, pressing down on her like a mantle, like a calling, like destiny. They'd tried to tend to her wounds, but she'd waved them away. The cuts and bruises and twisted ankle were nothing compared to what she carried inside. A rage refined by time, a purpose clarified by suffering, a will that had been tested in darkness and found unbreakable. The master had retreated to the big house after Silas's death, probably to drink whiskey and try to make sense of what had happened. The drivers stood in nervous clusters, unsure what to do with an overseer dead, and a woman who'd survived the unsurvivable standing before them like some kind of Old Testament prophet. But Sarah wasn't done. Lord have mercy, she wasn't nearly done. She walked, limped really, her bad ankle protesting every step, to the storage shed where they kept the plantation tools. The drivers watched but didn't stop her. Something in her eyes, something in the way she moved, made them hesitant to interfere. She found what she was looking for: Silas Crow's whip. The same whip that had scarred her back, that had marked so many others, that had been the instrument of terror for as long as anyone could remember. It hung on a nail, coiled like the serpents in the pit, waiting for its next victim. Sarah took it down. The leather was smooth from use, worn soft by contact with human flesh. She could feel the history in it, every scream, every plea, every drop of blood. The whip had memory, same as the land did, same as the people did. She carried it back to the quarters, and by then the sun was fully up, and more people had emerged from their cabins. Even some folks from neighboring plantations had arrived, drawn by news of Silas's death, drawn by rumors of Sarah's survival, drawn by something they couldn't name but needed to witness. The legend was already growing, spreading faster than cotton fire. Sarah de Cova, who'd spent 60 days with serpents. Sarah de Cova, who'd walked out of the pit on the same night the overseer died. Sarah de Cova, who the snakes wouldn't bite, who the darkness couldn't break, who'd become something more than human through suffering. But Sarah knew the truth. She was just a woman, scarred and starved and barely able to stand. Just a woman who'd survived because the alternative was letting them win, letting them prove that their cruelty could destroy anyone's spirit. And she wasn't finished bearing witness. The master emerged from the big house around mid-morning, flanked by his remaining drivers and a few white neighbors he'd sent for. They walked toward the quarters with the grim determination of men who knew order had to be restored, who knew that allowing this disruption to continue would undermine the entire system they'd built their wealth upon. They expected defiance, expected rebellion, expected violence even. What they got was Sarah, standing in the center of the quarters with Silas's whip in her hands, surrounded by every enslaved soul on the plantation. The crowd had grown until it felt like the whole county was there. House slaves and field hands, children and elders, the strong and the broken, all gathered to bear witness to whatever came next. "Sarah," the master said, trying for authoritative but landing somewhere near uncertain. "You need medical attention. You need rest. Put down the whip and—" "This whip," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying across the crowd, "has touched the flesh of every person here. Some of us more than others. Some of us died from it. Some of us wished we had." She held it up, and the leather caught the morning sun, gleaming like a promise or a threat depending on your perspective. Silas Crow used this whip to enforce bondage, used it to break spirits, used it to remind us every day that we were property, that we had no power, that our pain didn't matter. The crowd murmured agreement. The master shifted uncomfortably, hand moving toward the pistol at his belt but not quite drawing it. Too many eyes watching. Too many witnesses from other plantations. Too many white neighbors who might judge him for shooting an unarmed woman, even a slave. "But Silas is dead now," Sarah continued. "Died in the pit he made to punish me. Killed by the serpents he collected to torture me with. Divine justice, some might call it. Natural consequences, others would say." She looked directly at the master, her eyes burning with something that made him take a step back despite himself. "You thought throwing me in that pit would break me, would make an example, would show everyone what happens when slaves get ideas above their station. And you did make an example, just not the one you intended." Sarah began to walk, not toward the master but toward the whipping post, that cursed tree of bondage that stood at the center of the quarters like a monument to suffering. The crowd parted for her, then followed, creating a procession that felt almost ritualistic. When she reached the post, Sarah placed one hand on the rough wood. She could feel the grooves worn by rope, the stains that no amount of weather could wash away. The memories of everyone who'd been tied there and hurt there and broken there. Then, with deliberate precision, she placed Silas's whip at the base of the post. She knelt, her body protesting but her will stronger, and began to dig in the red clay with her bare hands, bloody as they were from writing on the pit walls. She dug until she'd made a hole deep enough, then laid the whip in it like a body being buried. "This is over," she said quietly, though her voice carried. "This particular instrument of torture, done, finished. We burying it today." The master found his voice. "Now you wait just a—" "No." Sarah stood facing him across the crowd. "You wait, you listen, because I got something to say and you gonna hear it and everyone here gonna witness it being said." The boldness should have gotten her killed, should have earned her another whipping, another punishment, another attempt to break her spirit. But something had shifted. The balance had tipped. The crowd behind her wasn't just watching anymore, they were standing with her, standing in solidarity, standing in defiance. The master saw it too, saw how his power, which had seemed absolute just days ago, was suddenly uncertain, saw how his remaining drivers weren't quite sure whose orders to follow, saw how even his white neighbors were watching him to see how he'd handle this unprecedented situation. "You put me in that pit to die," Sarah said. "But I didn't die. And now I'm standing here, and Silas is the one in the ground. That's the story folks gonna tell. That's the legend that's spreading plantation to plantation. Sarah de Cova, who the serpents wouldn't kill. Sarah de Cova, who survived 60 days in darkness. Sarah de Cova, who walked out of the grave." She picked up a handful of dirt and let it fall onto the buried whip. "You can't stop that story, can't control it, can't suppress it. It's alive now, growing, spreading, giving folks something you never wanted them to have. Hope. Hope that suffering don't last forever. Hope that cruelty gets answered. Hope that even in bondage, dignity survives. The master's hand was definitely on his pistol now, but he didn't draw it. Couldn't. Not with this many witnesses, not with the legend already spreading. Shooting her now would just make her a martyr, make the story even more powerful. "So here's what happens next," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her body's exhaustion. "I'm walking away from this whipping post, walking away from this plantation if you got any sense. Because if you keep me here, I'm gonna keep testifying. Keep bearing witness. Keep writing down names and crimes and truths you don't want known. And you can't stop me no more. You already tried your worst. Already threw me in the pit. Already made me a legend." She turned to the crowd, to her people, to the witnesses. "What happens to me don't matter as much as what this means for all of us. We survived. We're surviving. And we gonna keep surviving until the day comes. And it will come, believe me, when bondage itself ends. When these chains break. When freedom ain't just something we sing about in spirituals, but something we live." The sun was high now, burning down on the red Mississippi clay. Sarah stood there, covered in dirt and blood, and the scales of serpents, looking like something from ancient prophecy, looking like the answer to prayers spoken in whispers in dark cabins, looking like the future trying to break through the present. The master stared at her for a long moment, then he turned and walked back to the big house without another word. What else could he do? She'd already won, not the war, but this battle. And sometimes that was enough. Sarah looked down at the fresh grave where the whip was buried, then at the hands that had survived 60 days in darkness, then at the faces of her people watching with tears streaming down their cheeks. "Who suffered? Suffered," she said quietly, using words that felt old as Africa, old as bondage itself, old as the human capacity to endure the unendurable. "Who resisted, left memory. And memory we keep right here." She placed one hand over her heart, then gestured to the gathered crowd, to the buried whip, to the pit where she'd been reborn, to the quarters that held so much pain and so much strength both. Memory we keep in the echoes from the quarters, in the voices that won't be silenced, in the stories that won't die, in the testimony that survives even when they try to bury it. We remember, we survive, we witness, and someday, children, someday we'll be free. The crowd stood silent for a moment. Then someone began to sing. A spiritual, a work song, a hymn of resistance disguised as religious fervor. Others joined until the quarters rang with voices raised in harmony, in defiance, in hope. And Sarah Cova stood at the center of it all, scarred and broken and somehow impossibly undefeated. Her story already passing into legend, her name already becoming synonymous with survival itself. The serpents in the pit had taught her well. Even buried in darkness, even surrounded by death, life finds a way. Truth finds a voice. And memory, precious, powerful memory, endures.